Will Russia go to war against Ukraine? Moscow masses its troops along the border. What prompted the escalation? And how much of a threat is it to Ukraine's unity? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Concerns are growing of a possible war between Russia and Ukraine. The two have been in dispute since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatist fighting government troops in eastern Ukraine. There had been a relative stalemate in fighting, ceasefires and violations of ceasefires. But the situation is now on the brink of a major escalation. Kiev has expelled a Russian diplomat in response to a similar move by Moscow. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is beefing up his nation's naval presence in the Black Sea. The international community is alarmed. Well, since the start of the year, there's been more fighting in eastern Ukraine. Then, last month, Russia deployed its largest military buildup near Ukraine's border since 2014. NATO warned Russia it won't leave Kiev on its own and urged Moscow to withdraw its troops. US President Joe Biden called on Vladimir Putin to de-escalate tension. He's proposed a summit with the Russian president. European leaders have also demanded Russian forces are pulled back from the border. Ukraine's leader held talks with the French president and German chancellor in Paris on Friday. Aljazeera's Charles Stratford reports from Kiev on people's fears.
Ukrainian soldiers on the front line are on the highest level of alert since the signing of an often violated ceasefire agreement with pro-Russian separatists 7 years ago. Russia says its deployment of an estimated 100,000 soldiers and heavy weaponry to areas near the border with Ukraine poses no threat. Ukrainian military say they are preparing for the worst.
I was mobilized and came back to the front line. I believe this is a crucial moment to defend my country.
World leaders and NATO have urged Moscow to pull back its forces. Most of these houses were destroyed in fighting in 2015. Around 1 million people live in a 10-kilometre wide so-called contact zone that stretches on both sides across the front line. Oksana says she fled with her son Zhenya from separatist-controlled areas 2 years ago.
I have lived here since 2019. I used to live in Orlivka, but I had to flee because of my political views. It has been quiet these last 2 days, but this is the second night in a row my son wakes in the middle of the night screaming.
There is similar devastation in pro-Russia separatist-controlled areas.
They have been shooting recently. Everyone waits, but nobody knows how the negotiations will end.
The leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany and France, the so-called Normandy format, have repeatedly failed to find a political solution to the conflict. Ukraine refuses Russia's demand that it talk directly to pro-Moscow separatist leaders. Russia refuses to withdraw from Crimea, which it occupied in 2014. Analysts say political deadlock on many levels remain.
The breakdown in the current ceasefire was fairly predictable because the sides weren't negotiating in good faith. They'd stopped negotiating in good faith probably in about October, and they'd reached the point where they were, instead of trying to find common ground, they were deliberately putting forth proposals that they knew would annoy the other side or that they knew would be non-starters. And once that starts to happen, then you know that the breakdown of the ceasefire is only it's only a matter of time.
Russia calls it a military exercise. Ukraine says it is a dangerous provocation. After 7 years of failed peace negotiations, the UN says almost 3.5 million people are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance and protection in eastern Ukraine. Charles Stratford, Aljazeera, Kiev.
Well, let's bring in our guests into the show. We have joining us from Moscow, Viktor Olevich, a political analyst and lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. In Kiev, Mychailo Wynnyckyj, associate professor of sociology at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And in Oslo, Glenn Diesen, a professor of international relations at the University of Southeast Norway. Welcome to the show. If I could start with Mychailo. So why did the ceasefire collapse in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I think that's a question perhaps to to those that have invaded the country, and that's perhaps more a question of to the Russian side. The Russian side has been provoking the various types of escalations and non-escalations and ceasefires and non-ceasefires for the last 7 years. The reality is that Ukraine in 2014 lost a grand total of 7% of its territory. So it's actually not very much. 7% being lost, including the Crimea. So in other words, this is not exactly a huge amount of territory, but nevertheless, it is a thorn in Ukraine's side constantly because territory has been lost, and it's been lost due to aggression from the Russian side. So why are they continuing to attack? Why are they continuing to try to move forward after there have been? I mean, the Ukrainian side and the new president Zelensky has actually come out and said that it's very simple, that the Ukrainian side is going to stop shooting unless being shot at. So the provocations are coming from that side. I think the question is probably better to our Russian colleague.
Let's take a question then to Viktor in Moscow. What prompted the Russian military buildup that the world was kind of surprised to see so many Russian forces and tanks massing at the border, Viktor?
Well, the situation in southeastern Ukraine has to be looked at from the point of view of rivalry in Russian-American relations. And we have seen that Joseph Biden and those close to him in his foreign policy bloc had warned and had stated on numerous occasions during the election campaign last year that if their candidate was going to win, the American approach to Russia would be much tougher than Trump's approach, the Trump administration approach, that they're going to use various new instruments to pressure Russia on various fronts. And after Biden won the election last year and became U.S. president, his administration started to implement implement that course towards Russia. Sanctions have been expanded. Rhetoric towards Russia has been significantly hardened, and also Kiev has also toughened both its rhetoric towards Moscow and towards elements sympathetic to Russia within Ukraine, and has also taken more action against those elements. For example, the closing of several TV channels that were more sympathetic towards Russia, actions against Viktor Medvedchuk, a politician sympathetic to Moscow, and some other politicians.
All right.
And so Moscow is viewing this as a pressure point and is on a specific level. It's using the situation to pressure Ukraine as a bargaining chip, basically.
Okay, I can see there that Mychailo is shaking his head. I'll give you 15 seconds to come back in on some of that, Mychailo, before we move on to Glenn.
Okay, very quickly. I mean, at the end of the day, Ukraine is not a bargaining chip. Ukraine is a country. It's very nice that President Putin and psychoanalysts can probably have a field day with the Russian president. Thinks in terms of Russian-U.S. rivalry. That's all very fine and dandy, but it's not U.S. soldiers that are dying on the Ukrainian front, and it's Ukrainian soldiers that are defending their own country. This has nothing to do, in fact, except for in strange minds with geopolitics. This has everything to do with a very real war that is happening in a very real country that has nothing to do with
Mychailo,
the United States.
wouldn't it be fair
to do with Europe.
Wouldn't it be fair, though, to say that Ukraine is caught in the geopolitics of relations between the US and Russia? You do recognize that, don't you?
Well, of course it's caught in that. Of course it's caught in that. It's caught as a trap. But I think that the thing that I'm trying to get away from is the narrative that is being proposed by the Kremlin, which basically says that Ukraine doesn't matter as such. It's simply a territory over which supposedly the U.S. and Russia are going to be fighting. And that's just the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, it's a country of 40 million people.
Maybe out of fairness, let me give also 15 seconds to Viktor if he wants to pick up on anything before I move on to Glenn.
Well, there is no question that the situation that had developed in Ukraine in the past 7 years has been both unfortunate and very tragic for the country and for both those that live on the territories controlled by Kiev and in the territories that are controlled by the so-called People's Republics in the southeast. However, Ukraine is a matter of negotiation and of rivalry between the major powers.
Between the US and Russia.
And that is simply a fact that, that is simply a fact that Kiev has to take into account and does take into account in its policy deliberations.
Since we're talking about geopolitics between countries, Glenn, I want to ask you, to what extent is the whole issue of NATO membership playing out here? I think it was 3 days after Joe Biden took office, there was some talk from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian president, in fact, about moving forward with the process of joining NATO. Is this Russia's way of saying NATO membership is a red line?
No, definitely. I think, again, I think we should all be empathetic about the difficult situation Ukraine is in, but it has to be pointed out that this is mostly about NATO expansion. And one also has to point out that it's important to note that Ukraine actually began, emboldened by the US, to mobilize its troops towards the contact line with Donbass before Russia then responded by mobilizing its troops. So Russia's been very clear, therefore, that it would intervene if it's attacked. And the reason, yes, NATO, also it has a domestic component, of course, that is Russia can't really just stand by. It's politically impossible if its compatriots in eastern Ukraine are mowed down by the Ukrainian army. But primarily, this is about NATO. This is the geopolitical problem that was caused 7 years ago. NATO expansionism into Ukraine is deemed to be an existential threat to Russia. So this is the source of the conflict. That is, NATO refuses to halt its expansion and pursue neutral alternatives for countries along the Russian borders, while Russia has set a clear red line against further expansion, which it intends to uphold. Now, previously you mentioned that there was no political solutions, but the Minsk agreement was the mutual agreement for a political settlement, and this agreement did entail that that government in Kyiv would negotiate directly with the authorities in Donbass and pursue deep constitutional reforms to decentralize power and grant Donbass a certain degree of autonomy. The problem, of course, for Ukraine is if they do it, they're going to have a lot of internal divisions, because the Ukrainian nationalists will not accept this. And furthermore, an autonomous Donbass could block NATO expansionism. Now, this is the main reason why both Ukraine and the US has been signaling that they do not intend to honor the obligations under the Minsk agreement. So I think all of this very much responds to the issue of NATO expansion.
Right. I can see Mychailo is shaking his head again. So let me give you a chance to come back in on some of this.
I'm quite frankly shocked by what my Norwegian colleague is talking about. Look, NATO expansion into Ukraine was not an issue and was never even a possibility until 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine. The poll results are very, very clear. The political situation was very, very clear. NATO was never, ever on the agenda, and accession to NATO was never on the agenda until such time as Russia decided to attack Ukraine. So to now state that somehow Ukraine is at fault for for actively pursuing NATO membership, I mean, what exactly would be the logical alternative? When you are attacked, when your territory is taken away by a country that supposedly was a guarantor of peace when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum, supposedly Russia was supposed to guarantee Ukraine's borders. Here Russia's coming in and violating those borders, and the only way that Ukraine is going to be able to defend itself is through NATO. But what is very important is that, in fact, what my colleague just recently said is, in fact, just basically not true. Ukraine did not mobilize any troops, and nor is it in any shape or form possible that Ukraine would attack Russia. This is a narrative that is being propagated by the Kremlin at this point that is completely untrue. Ukraine has a grand total army of 250,000 troops. Russia has over 1 million people under arms, 1 million men, 1 million troops. There is no possible way that Ukraine is going to be attacking Russia. Russia may be attacking Ukraine and may be taking more territory. And that, of course, is in Russia's interest, because at this point, the annexation of Crimea is obviously very much untenable because there's a problem of water, there's a problem of resources, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, we're running out of time, and we do have other points to cover. Let me give Glenn, I can see Glenn wants to get in on this, but in 15 seconds, sir.
Yes, well, in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine would eventually become a member, and this has been a thorn in the side ever since. Now, my point is simply, if NATO expansionism is really off the table, why doesn't NATO go out and put this in writing and say to Russia, this would definitely calm down the conflict and it would open up for other neutral alternatives?
All right. Okay, let me give 15 seconds back to you, Mychailo, before we go once again to Moscow with Viktor.
Look, I'm going to be very brief. At the end of the day, there's 100,000 troops that are Russian troops that are being massed on the borders of Ukraine. These, in fact, troops, if they are going to be invading Ukraine, will not be invading the Donbass, because frankly, the Donbass and the area that is being currently disputed is actually a depressed region. There's very little interest in actually taking it. However, there is an interest, obviously a geopolitical interest and a very clear economic interest in creating a land bridge to Crimea. And that means cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea. That has strategic interest, and obviously but that has nothing to do with NATO or anything else. That's simply Russian expansionism and imperialism. Okay, we've made your point. Let me ask Viktor, what is the bottom line of this phase of the escalation? Do you think Russia wants to go to war with Ukraine directly and overtly enter into a war with Ukraine?
Look, despite Kiev's aspirations, Ukraine is not about to become a NATO member. And one of the reasons for that is that it has an active territorial dispute with one of its neighbors, in this case with Russia. And traditionally, NATO does not accept new members that have active conflicts with their neighbors, because in that case, NATO could be forced to intervene directly, and that's not something that Washington and its NATO allies
does this support the idea that Moscow escalated or put its troops at the border to make this an issue to block Ukraine ever from thinking or being able to join NATO rather than thinking?
Exactly. One of the reasons for Russia intervening in 2014 was that after Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president, was deposed in a coup and a much more pro-Western government came to power in Kiev, Moscow was concerned that the new government, the new more pro-Western government, could seek NATO membership and took action in part to prevent that. Moscow sees NATO expansion as a strategic threat, and it took direct action to prevent that from NATO from expanding to Ukraine. And we see that play out throughout the last 7 years. So that threat of NATO expansion to Ukraine, the direct expansion has been sort of moved back. At the same time, Moscow is seeking to use its presence on Ukraine's borders as a show of force, as a show of its possible force projection and of its capabilities. At the same time, what my Ukrainian colleague has been saying, what he said about the land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia, that is something that Russia simply does not have resources to sustain. So even if Russia would undertake that action, the Russian economy would not be able to sustain those territories, massive new territories within Russia. So that's not something that Russia would seek to do other than some Putin loyalists simply making stark and loud statements.
All right, let's not get
that.
bogged down too much into some minutiae of particular movements on the ground. I want to try and maybe broaden the discussion out with Mychailo, if I may, and ask about what this whole cycle means, of the cycle of tension and escalation means for polarization within Ukraine.
Well, in fact, one of the things that we've seen over the last 7 years is a unification of Ukraine. It's not been a polarization. It's been actually a much more of a unification. I do want to make one more point and one last point about the NATO thing, just so that we realize. I mean, it's not just a question of Russia reacting to NATO expansion. Ukraine is a sovereign country. Ukraine has been attacked. 7% of its territory has been taken away illegally. It has a right to defend itself. Defending itself means through alliances. This is a logical step. This is not a question of, someone is attacking Russia. No one's attacking Russia. Russia has attacked and Ukraine is defending itself. That, in fact, is a narrative that has very much united the Ukrainian population.
What about, Mychailo, if I could jump in there, the moves which the Ukrainian President Zelensky made to close the TV station of the pro-Russian oligarch, as he's seen, Viktor Medvedchuk. Won't moves like that further alienate at least those ethnic Russians in Ukraine or Ukrainians of ethnic Russian origin? That is a polarization, is it not?
First of all, ethnic Russians in Ukraine, according to the very recent, now that the Crimea has been annexed and is not counted as part of Ukraine, now that the eastern regions of the Donbass have not been counted as part of Ukraine, so that we understand ethnic Russians in Ukraine make up less than 5% of the population. So alienating a group of less than 5% of the population may be, of course, problematic from the point of view of humanitarian, etc. But we need to understand that 95% of the population is in support of Ukrainian unity and sees Russia as an aggressor. With respect to those three channels, yes, it's true. But in fact, those three channels were outlets for basically money laundering of illegal activities by Viktor Medvedchuk, who in fact is basically a family member of Putin. He was laundering money from illegal activities within Ukraine, including financing separatists on the eastern side. So, I mean, it's really problematic with respect to these three channels. Yes, there is an issue. Those three channels were closed. There were no protests against that, unlike various other things that have caused protests in the streets recently. The ratings of those channels were, in fact, very, very low. They were broadcasting pro-Russian propaganda, and it wasn't being supported by the Ukrainian population. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's created more of a ruckus in the Kremlin than it has in Kyiv.
All right, I could see Glenn there wants to get in on this. Let me bring you in for some perspective. Yeah. I think we've got about a minute left, though.
Yeah, no, I would point out that if Ukraine indeed was this united, Zelensky would not continuously fear the right. That is the Ukrainian nationalists, because if Ukraine would actually live up to its obligations under the Minsk agreement and talk to Donbass, you would very quickly see Ukrainian nationalists march through Kiev. So there is a strong, very limited what can actually be done. So also, one shouldn't confuse necessarily with ethnic Russians as opposed to Russian speakers as well. And overall, I wouldn't disagree that the conflict has obviously pushed greater unity in Ukraine in terms of standing up for their sovereignty. But to suggest that suddenly everyone is on the same page, anti-Russian, behind the anti-Russian policies, I definitely would not agree with. And every poll indicates this as well. That is, everyone does not support NATO and against Russia. Okay.
I'm afraid we are out of time, so we are going to end it there. Let's thank our guests very much, Viktor Olevich, Mychailo Wynnyckyj, and Glenn Diesen. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now, it's goodbye.